Reactive Training Systems.
Just got done with my training session / podcast with Bryce Lewis, driving home, and before any of this kind of gets too far away from my mind, I wanted to go ahead and kind of record the intro piece to this podcast. I had a really good time talking with Bryce, and a good time training with Bryce, and I think in particular the portion of the podcast kind of toward the latter half of the podcast where we started to talk about some coaching things where disagree even is maybe the wrong word, but just some areas where we could learn from one another. I think that was particularly an interesting portion of the podcast for me. Talking about different programming strategies, appropriate uses for different programming strategies, how we deal with various problems as coaches. I think it was really fun. It was a really fun chat, and I hope you guys really enjoy it and really learn a lot from it. Like I mentioned kind of later on in the podcast, Bryce has his own podcast if you're interested in checking out the TSA podcast. And then for our podcast, for the RTS podcast, I would like to hear some feedback from you guys. What are some things that you would like to hear about, some topics that you'd like to hear about? Who are some guests that you would like me to bring on and have some chats with? If you guys want to leave me any feedback like that, please send that to me directly. You can do that through Facebook, you can do that through Instagram, you can do it through email. It's mike@reactivetrainingsystems.com. You can drop me an email anytime if you have any sort of suggestions about the podcast. Anyway, that's all I've got. I don't want to delay this any further. So with that, here he is, Bryce Lewis.
Okay. Still a lot of breath from training.
Those sets of 10 were difficult, man.
For me, they were. It's funny because the training feels hard, but it's not hard in the same way that real training is hard.
I've had some people going through some injuries, and we've had to bump the reps way up. And I've warned them the RPE is going to be way different. RPE 9 for a triple is way different than RPE 9 for 15.
It is, yeah. It's almost like not to overcomplicate what should be a simple concept, but it's almost like a percentage,
Yeah.
It's like a percentage of maximum effort. But anyway, I probably shouldn't say stuff like that because people already overcomplicate the concept. But yeah, it is. It's way different, for a lot of reps, and it's different for me at least now too. It's different movements and all that stuff.
I agree. That throws another challenge into it.
Yeah. How about for you? How's your prep going for Belarus?
It's been good for the most part. We've been training really hard for the first part of this year, and I've been able to set a lot of rep PRs, which has just been fantastic. So, we've been programming off of some higher 1RMs, which has meant that even if it's sets of 4 at 82% or something, it's going to be much more challenging. So a lot of the even normal hypertrophy work I've hit along the way has indicated a lot of progress.
That's good.
Yeah. So I've been really happy about that, and we've been prepping for this deadlift, invitational. So that's been a lot of fun too, and just lately I've dealt with some hip type stuff that I'm working through, but I'm pretty optimistic, and even if I hit numbers I've already hit before, it'll be a competitive day. Yeah.
Well, the class as a whole, I'm sure I don't have to tell you, is pretty stacked.
Yeah.
It went from one being I know there's some freaks waiting in the wings, to then it's all you guys showed up at once,
Yeah, tell me about it. Garrett Blevins blew up. It just seems like everyone put together their best performance,
Yeah, so that's cool. That's cool. It's going to be exciting to watch. So is there anything you're doing different for this prep?
So
I know you've kind of been Mr. Consistency for a long time, right? We've talked about this in the past, that it's been very similar training for a long time. Are you still kind of riding that wave?
Yeah, we are. So when I first bumped up from the 93s to the 105s, that coincided with adding a 5th day of training to shorten the training sessions, so I didn't have to spend as much time like away from training or away from work. And ever since those two things, like, it's just been, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah.
And so it's been progress. Okay, great. Plug in training maxes. You know, maybe switch an assistance movement here or there, but keep things roughly the same. And you know, luckily enough, that's been the way things have gone.
You know, one thing that I find is with like high talent lifters, they tend to really be able to, you know, suck the marrow out of a training strategy for a long time.
Yeah.
You know, Bryce Krawczyk is a guy that he's like my go-to example for guys like that I've worked with that are kind of like that.
Yeah.
You give them a training strategy and they just kind of go with it and go with it and go with it.
Uh-huh.
And of course it always eventually tapers off, but you're in such a much better place when it finally does, and you have all the rest of the tools at your disposal, you know. I think it's just a smart way to go.
Yeah.
That's cool to hear, though, that you're able to continue that, you know, even at this level.
I think so too. I've been lucky in some senses that I haven't needed to kill myself with training volume to progress. You know, I don't know exactly what the genetic reason is or something like that, but I do think that, you know, I've been lucky in that way, and I definitely don't take that for granted. So it's been a little bit easier to be able to get progress done at a lower training volume.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think there's a lot to be said for that too, in terms of just it's beneficial, you know.
Yeah,
just to get something out of a lower training volume. You reach for those higher volumes if you have to, but not to go for it too early. You know, there's a lot of additional wear and tear that comes into play with like really pushing the volumes a lot harder than harder than is necessary, I guess. You know, but yeah.
Well, it's super interesting that you are coaching like two of the huge guys in the 105s headed up, and I'm sure they're, you know, they've got different training strategies leading up and need different things.
Yeah. I'm not sure how they feel about this conversation.
Hanny and I always joke because Hanny's coaching Garrett Blevins.
Yeah.
And we always joke there's a conflict of interest there too.
Right, yeah. Well, I mentioned Bryce Krawczyk.
Yeah.
Don't you guys call him Other Bryce?
Other Bryce. Yeah, exactly. Lovingly though, he's an awesome guy.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a neat aspect about this as well. I'm sure one that you enjoy as a lifter. I know I do as well.
I do.
You know.
I wish I knew Christoph a little bit better. Like, I'm sure if there wasn't a language barrier, that'd be easier too.
Yeah, that would be neat. And, you know, another question I have for you. Like, we'll sit here and have this conversation now, and you're clearly a very analytical guy, you know. But then I see other videos of you in training, and you seem to be a much more emotional lifter. So do you consider yourself to be an analytical lifter or an emotional lifter or somewhere in between? Or
So I would consider myself an emotional lifter. Like it's fine to, let me back up. I can get bogged down when things don't go right. My explanatory style is like trying to figure out what's wrong and, you know, what did I do? How can I fix this and stuff like that. But in trying to get best performances out of myself, like I'm super emotional and like not as resilient to changes as I'd like to be. So, you know, if training environment isn't like perfect or conditions aren't perfect or like, you know, if I had a meal too early or too late or stuff like that, like that stuff can all get to my head and it shouldn't really. Like those are tiny, tiny variables. But I can let those things get to my head in a way that's counterproductive. On the other hand, like I think emotions can serve you in a really positive way. Like I can get into a song and I swear it boosts performance like to a huge degree. Or like I can feed off the set that my warm-ups were flying up and just like take comfort in that and be able to push harder than normal. So I think if you're able to use emotions like as a tool, they can be super positive.
Yeah, I would agree with that. You know, the control aspect is probably the biggest thing, you know, to have it when you need it, you know.
Yeah. Like analysis too,
yeah.
You know, like it's good to have it when you need it, but like there are times where you don't need to analyze at all, and it's counterproductive.
Oh, absolutely. You know, and I hear about that sometimes. Like people talk about paralysis by analysis, or you know, whatever the catchphrase is going to be.
Yeah.
You know, while you're there in the gym is not the time for it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's you know, you're there, execute the plan. You know, analyze insofar as what you need to do to execute that plan.
Yeah.
But not anything over and above that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you're away from the gym and hopefully thinking a bit more clearly, that would be the time for the analysis piece. You know, I guess training emotion is the same thing. You know, using that tool with a little maturity.
Yeah, exactly. Like finding that peak state of arousal that just like works
Yeah.
perfectly for you.
Yeah, yeah. I think, is that a thing that you coach in other lifters as well? Like, I know that like the psychological component of training is something that is important to you.
Yeah, I've lately been really passionate about the kind of like mental side of things because I've seen it have such a big effect on myself, and then lately noticed it more in other lifters as well. So it's been nice to be able to help a lot of people through their relationships with lifting. And it is something that if the lifter is open to it, that I've helped them coach through it to get people a better relationship with their sport, you know, like in lots of different ways. So some people are chronic overworkers, and I've been able to show them like, look, we can get away with less and you can get more progress out of it. You know, like it doesn't require killing yourself in the gym to be able to get progress. So kind of correcting that misconception has helped them like have a healthy relationship with lifting. Or other people like over analyzing lifting technique, you know, like messaging me a video and saying, hey, is this perfect? You know, like what can I do to change this? And after enough of those and things looking almost identical video to video, you have to stop and say like, this is counterproductive.
Right.
You need to relax and just lift and let it be. So being open to that, knowing the lifter and helping out with some of those misconceptions, like that's definitely a way forward.
Okay. Okay. So you're kind of relying on the cues from the lifter then to tell you when to make those types of interventions?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's not a lot of things that you can do clearly off the start to say like, hey, these are good practices to set up. I will say that most people that pursue coaching are already, you know, they're people who think about their training and they're passionate about wanting to pursue this stuff. You don't have to say like, hey, go in the gym and train, like don't miss training days, because they do that already.
Right.
Oftentimes
Thankfully.
exactly.
Thankfully. Yeah.
Oftentimes it's correcting the overexertions, being too ambitious and stuff like that.
Yeah, I hear that a lot from coaches that say like, you know, holding lifters back is probably the biggest part of their job, more than pushing them ahead, because they're already self-starters. I mean,
yeah,
why else would you be doing this? You know, if you're
yeah,
a
exactly.
self-starter. So that's cool. So what kind of I guess advice do you give in those types of scenarios? Like, let's say that you've got a lifter who's like, let's go with the first example that you gave, that, you know, they're paranoid about technique being absolutely perfect.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, you're looking at their videos and you're going, "Look, man, that's fine. You know, you're well within parameters there. Just..."
Yeah, there's a lot of different things that could be going on. Some people think that the value of a coach is constant correction. You know, like, you know, I'm paying for you to adjust things constantly and stuff like that. And I think when things are good enough, like technique specifically, if technique is good enough, strength training and being consistent in the gym takes care of progress.
Yeah.
You know, and technical mastery is a very worthy goal. But I think that after a certain point, the path to technical mastery is repetition. It's not correction, you know? It's you getting under the barbell and just doing the same thing over and over again, and maybe realizing for yourself, like, oh, if I shift my center of balance just a little bit,
right.
Or, you know, maybe on my 1000th rep, I learn exactly when to speed up in the hole a little bit to get some stretch reflex. Like, those are things that are very, very hard to, from the outside, see and correct.
Yeah.
But they lead to technical mastery, and I think that it's just practice.
Yeah. I think there's something similar with RPE in general, as I teach it, you know, that we see people, you know, let's say I want them to go to the gym and do a triple at a 9 RPE, and they mess it up, and they actually go to the gym and they do a triple using too much weight, and it's a 10 RPE instead. I mean, is it ideal? No, it's not ideal. It's not perfect.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to freak out about it because my operating assumption is that you're at least a intelligent enough human being that you can recognize that and make some corrections, and next time you'll rate a little bit more accurately.
Yeah.
So although it's not ideal for this moment, there's a learning component to it that's maybe more valuable down the road than anything else that I would say in that situation, you know.
And I bet hearing from you, like, you know, bad dog, essentially, like, they don't want to hear that either.
Right, yeah, I wouldn't want to hear that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you touched on something that I thought was interesting, and I know that this is a thing that you've definitely put a lot of thought into as far as, like, what is the value of a coach? Like, what is the role of a coach?
Yeah.
Like, how do you see that taking shape for you?
Mm-hmm. You mean for me specifically, or like for me as a coach?
Well, just, I guess, how do you see the role as a coach? And, I mean, I'm assuming that necessarily that will be, you know, through the lens of how you operate.
Definitely. So there are like a few big pillars that I think coaches provide. Number one is programming, you know, like putting a plan in place based on the lifter that we both think, the lifter and myself, is going to make them, you know, progress. Second big piece is adjusting that plan when things go great or when things don't go great, which I guess could still be in programming. And then the third big thing is support for the lifter, whether that's emotional support or, you know, physical support, or creating a team environment where they can reach out to other athletes. Like, finding that support network is huge, you know, and like I knew that a long time ago, but lately I've been looking at self-determination theory, which is like this theory of motivation, saying that like there are 3 big reasons why people are motivated generally, and this applies to sport too. Like, one of those is relatedness, the degree to which you know, can share this with other people and feel valued and stuff like that. Competence, that you feel that you can succeed in it, and autonomy, that you feel like you've got control over your destiny in this sport. So kind of like hitting those 3 pieces in different ways in conversations, like, is huge for keeping people happy and enjoying this.
Yeah, yeah. I would imagine that that's, yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this thought coherently, but I would imagine that hitting those pillars for an athlete, it makes the whole experience a bit more enjoyable. It makes them happy to be where they're at and happy with the progress that they're getting. And since we know that, you know, this tends to be a long-term game, you know, that having that sort of enjoyment in the short term leads into more long-term success.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of things that can fall into that enjoyment piece, you know, I mean, like, I'm not saying athletes are going to be skipping into every session or something like that. You know, like, there's a lot of work to be done in powerlifting. Like, a lot of it is not fun, it's not sexy.
Yeah.
But especially powerlifters find joy in progress.
Yeah.
So finding ways to frame progress, saying, hey, like, look what you've done compared to where you were.
Yeah.
It's like, that's great.
Yeah. And I guess enjoyment's really the wrong word. And, you know, tisk for me, because I've said this before, that, like, I don't even, for myself at this stage of my training, like, training's not fun in the way that, like, playing a game is fun, or, you know, I don't know, other activities that are fun. You know, it's enjoyable, it's satisfying, gratifying in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, otherwise you wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
But it's not, yay, you know?
Yeah. I mean, you want people to be intrinsically motivated, like, to
Yeah.
do this because they love doing it.
Yeah.
You know, but I think powerlifters, especially like intermediate and advanced powerlifters, are insanely good at delayed gratification.
Yeah.
You know, like, just grinding, and then pushing off gratification for this big reward down the road where you compete in that meet and you crush a PR and, like, you get this huge surge of happiness.
Well, here's a question for you. It's something that just popped into my mind, and I guess the answer is a bit more philosophical. Do you think that powerlifting selects for those types of people that are good at delayed gratification, or do you think that powerlifting helps train delayed gratification in a person?
That's interesting. I think sport generally helps train like delayed gratification too, to varying degrees in different sports, like with the makeup of the sport. But we were talking earlier about the fact that I think powerlifting brings a lot of analytic minds, like people that just enjoy breaking things down. I said that people probably wouldn't sign up for a microcycles class on baseball, for instance, in the same way that they soak up for powerlifting.
Right.
So it definitely brings analytic minds, because I think it's something that if you understand like some of the inner workings, there's a real reward from that. You can apply that, you can progress faster and stuff like that. And that's exciting to a lot of people. But in terms of the delayed gratification, I don't know. That's tough to say.
I mean, like my gut feeling is that it's probably both to some degree. At the same time, I know that my internal bias is going to be that I want there to be some sort of character development from this.
Yeah.
So, I'll put my biases out there in that way. But, I do think that there probably is some sort of character development for it. Like, that it teaches you something that just naturally gets carried over into the rest of life.
I totally agree.
Although I don't know that for sure, and, again with the biases thing, but
I think there's a lot of lessons that you can learn from powerlifting if you want to. I mean, number one, like the huge one is adherence. If you put in work, there is reward. Like there is this relationship between how hard you work and how much result you get. And I forget who I was talking with. I think it was actually on our podcast recently. That relationship doesn't exist in such a clear-cut way in other areas of life.
Right.
So finding that is good. Also, like discipline, nutritionally for a lot of people. Like there are going to be times where you have no choice but to do roughly this protocol in order to get the result that you want, that you signed up for. And if you do, then there's success as a result of that. So yeah, like I think that's huge too.
That's one of the things that I'm having trouble with words today, man. Like I forgot like 8 names while we were training. Anyway, we'll just kind of move on from that.
Sure.
One thing, and I mentioned this to you before we got going.
Yeah.
That one thing I think is interesting to talk about anytime we do conversations like this is topics, areas of disagreement.
Yeah.
For a couple reasons. One, it's I think useful to see that people can think about these things deeply and disagree and not come to blows over it.
Yeah.
And also that I think that's where we have the most to learn from each other.
Definitely.
So I'd like to ask you if you have anything that comes to mind that you would say is a topic of disagreement between the two of us.
Right. So you brought this up earlier, and it gave me some chances to think about it. And like we agree on a lot of things, or our training is subtle variations of the same basic idea of volume causes progress. You need to train relatively heavy. You need to train relatively close to competition squat, bench, and deadlift. But when I saw some of last year's Project Momentum and saw the athletes were deadlifting 4 times a week, that's not something I would ever consider giving to an athlete. And it struck me as really weird that was something you were trying. So I was curious to know about that. So that's something, I don't know if we disagree on it, but I want to know more about it.
Sure. Well, the thinking behind it was, we have a certain amount of volume that's done in a given week, and we found that splitting that volume up into shorter sessions throughout the week has been useful. It was partly about looking for is there a certain minimum session volume? So although they were deadlifting 4 times a week, it was sometimes it was less than 70%, but usually between 70 and 75% for like 3 sets of 5.
Yeah.
So it wasn't terribly difficult training.
Right.
It was training. and my curiosity was like, well, what will this do? I had tested it on a couple people, including myself, and we had positive experiences with it. So the thought was like, well, what if we can, try it with a lot more people and see if this is a generalizable result.
And the weird thing is, like, I have seen great results from that kind of thing in squatting and in benching for sure, but I haven't in deadlifting. Like, it just seems so systemically fatiguing, even at lower intensities, that it just seemed to trash people that I even tried like 3 times frequency on. Yeah,
well, I would say that I don't reach for that strategy lightly. And I wouldn't. I don't even go in that direction with some guys. Like one guy that comes to mind is Kelly Brenton. We're finding the more, and we've still got some tinkering to do, I think, but we're finding that the more we restrict deadlifting frequency, even to the point of, only pulling from the floor every other week, that is seeming to have a positive effect. Now, if you look at the differences, the average guy doing Project Momentum is your average powerlifter who's got 3 years experience, a middle 300 Wilks score. He's a middleweight guy. That's kind of who was the average person having those experiences, and generally that was a positive result. But then you take a guy like Kelly, who's a heavyweight, one of the strongest heavyweights in the world. And generally, they have a bit harder time with recovery from things like that. And you take it also, speaking of Kelly, he's an excellent bencher. Not built quite so well for deadlifting, but still, we both feel like it's not an impossible nut to crack,
Sure,
but yeah, so I think that people like that would definitely need, maybe I shouldn't say definitely, they're more likely to need training that goes in the other direction.
Right. Right.
And in general, I would tend to agree with you that deadlift is going to be the last one that gets that kind of frequency kick.
Yeah. But I mean, there was that Norwegian training study, which I was blown away by the results of. They, for the listeners, they took 2 groups of seasoned powerlifters. So these are not, like...
junior national competitors, right? I would say.
These weren't just, gym bros or people who've resistance trained here and there.
Right.
One group with volume matched approaches was lifting 3 times per week, and the other group was lifting 6 times per week. So they doubled the frequency, and the increase in progress was substantial in the group that was doubled.
I think that it's... Now, correct me if I'm wrong, because I haven't looked at that study in kind of a while, but they saw better results in the squat and the bench than they did in the deadlift.
They did, yeah. And I talked to one of the researchers, Alexander Kirkatake, and he gave me like an example of what one of the weeks was. And like you were talking about, some of the intensities weren't all that high. It was basically triples for 75 to 80% for most of it. Which is pretty manageable. We're talking RPEs like 8 at the highest, for some of that work. And so it seemed doable on paper. It wasn't like every session was backbreaking or anything like that. But I think they did see more progress on squat and bench.
Right. Well, and to kind of throw in a data point that's going in the other direction, we mentioned Bryce Krawczyk. He's had some hip issues and some pain issues going on, and he's got it mostly resolved, mostly under control now. But one thing that he's noticed, especially lately, is that the higher frequency seems to help with that. Whether it's the constant exposure or no one session is breaking down too much tissue. Maybe. I mean, we could come up with various theories about why.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is that he's doing it, and it seems to be resulting in less pain or less sessions with a painful component. So that's a positive as well. And that's also a thing that I remember the guys who were advocating daily squat maxing, daily 1RM basically daily squat training in general.
Yeah.
One of the benefits that they talked about from time to time was that, you would think that this is going to beat you down and wear you out, but what they ended up finding was that their injuries tended to ache less. Which is kind of maybe a weird thing.
It seems weird, yeah. Like, we think that exposure to something makes it worse over time.
Yeah.
But it seems to be better in this case, as long as you're not squatting with pain as you're doing it.
Yeah, and I think that's a big key, right?
Yeah.
That it has to be pain-free movement to begin with.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're moving in pain and doing it frequently, then I think that's having the opposite effect of what you want, right?
I very much agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're just kicking the recovery ball down the road.
Right, yeah. So, I would say that's an interesting topic, yeah?
I agree, yeah.
See, point of disagreement that's worth talking about, right?
But, I mean, it goes to the point, like, individual differences are so individual.
Oh, yeah. Well,
like
vast,
the training response,
too, right? Yeah. It blows me away, like, just looking at, like, I'm in disbelief over some of the stuff that I find in the training of my athletes sometimes.
Yeah.
We can say general things about training, about a training response. So, for example, generally as you go into a competition, you want higher intensities. That's going to help a lifter get stronger and peak for a competition.
Yeah.
And that's true most of the time. But I've had more than one athlete who, whenever we push into those higher intensities, they just go,
yeah,
and it's like, well, what if we just don't do that? Like, you seem to get stronger doing like 70-75% work. What if we just do that?
Yeah.
And so far it's been great. Yeah. No, I wouldn't reach for that for everybody.
Right.
And you don't do that prematurely, and it has to be part of a larger strategy, blah, 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 blah. All these disclaimers.
Caveat, yeah.
Right, but still, like, that's a big departure from the traditional
Well, let me ask you a coaching question then.
Yeah.
How do you put on your coaching hat that might be totally different for athlete A versus athlete B? Like, how do you get yourself in the mindset to be able to create training for that specific athlete when it might be so different from, like, a departure from what you normally do?
I'm a process guy, like head to toe.
Yeah.
Checklists for, like, even for writing training. Now, I mean, there's still a significant skill component to it.
Yeah.
But there's still kind of a method. So one of the things that we do, like we were talking while we were training about the training log software that we put on the RTS website. And one of the components that we've added to it is a reporting feature. And we do block reviews as part of that. So every time we finish a training block, we run a block review on it, and that kind of gives us an overview of how did you feel during this block, what were the results of the block, and kind of what were the characteristics of training.
Yeah.
And so what I can do is I take a lifter, say somebody who's going to go to whatever major competition.
Sure.
It's a competition that we don't want to mess around with. We don't want to be experimenting or anything. So we pull all these block reviews and we look at them and we go, oh, every time that we do, 70-75%, your lifts go up. And every time we go past that, your lifts go down.
Yeah.
You start to develop a picture, and one or two block reviews isn't enough. You get multiples, and then you start to see, hey, every time we have floor presses in here, that's good for you. And then every time we do this other thing, that's bad for you.
Yeah.
So we're making this training cycle, and it's going to lead into a major competition. So we'll plan that to pull all those greatest hits, so to speak. And that's kind of how it goes,
Yeah.
Yeah, and so far that's been great, So that's kind of the process that I use.
Yeah.
Do you kind of go a similar direction, or maybe
I do.
Different?
We don't necessarily do block reviews.
Right.
With the athletes that I work with on a weekly basis, like, you get some fair feedback about how things are feeling and stuff like that. But usually we don't know how. I mean, we can look at estimated 1 rep maxes, of course, but ultimately you've got to wait until the reps are getting low and the weight's getting heavy to find out, like, hey, how's this plan working out?
Right.
So I'm looking over slightly longer periods of time than you are, but the process is still the same. Like, find the things that we think are working and keep in the good stuff and get rid of the things that aren't working and go from there. Like, I've had some people where I've given them like 5 sets of 8 on a movement, and like I'm cringing writing it down because that would crush me myself, and I have to separate Bryce the lifter from Bryce the coach.
Right. Well, yeah, I would say that's, since I tend to program so heavy into RPE, I get a somewhat of a respite from that, but I feel that same sort of cringe when I'm putting in percentage training for some lifters.
Yeah.
So, for example, 75% for a set of 5.
Mm-hmm.
Most lifters, that's pretty sub-max effort work.
Yeah.
But I've got a few lifters who it'll be kind of sub-max effort work for the first couple sets, but if we go on for very long, then that's turned into some pretty grindy reps.
Yeah.
And that's tough. It's tough to remember. So, as a strategy, we just tend to select strategies that work around that in various ways. Rather than me trying to bias the percentage, I'll say something completely different, like work up to a set of 10 at like a 9 RPE or something like that. And then we'll use that weight for, multiple sets of 5 afterwards. But we kind of use that to benchmark the weight for the day.
Yeah, I totally get that.
Yeah.
That's an awesome way to go about it.
That's cool. That's interesting to see how, similarities and differences populate across different training systems.
Yeah. Like, there's some light females, for instance, like who can hit sets of 6 at 80% like breezy, you know, and that's weird to me.
Yeah.
But you still have to program it because it's exactly what they need.
Speaking of 80% work, we can talk about it a little bit now because the project's over. But Project Momentum this year, is we had a number of different groups. In the first week, we had them test 1RMs and as many reps as possible with 80%. The average reps with 80% was, I believe, 8. The 7s and 8s were the most common, although the range, we had one lifter who got 4 reps with 80%. We had one lifter that got 15 reps with 80%.
Damn.
So it was a huge range, right? The average, people kind of clump around the average. But so we split them into groups, trained some with high reps and some with low reps.
Yeah.
And what I want to see is if reps with 80% is in any way predictive of what you'll respond better to in training. For example, let's say you're a lifter who can do 10 reps at 80%.
Yeah.
Does that mean that you should train with high reps? Or does it mean that you should train with low reps? Or does it mean nothing?
Right. Yeah. The one thing that I'm wondering is, like, just because you tested an AMRAP with 80% doesn't mean, like, every time they do that, they'll be able to hit that same range. Sure.
Well, definitely a limitation, right?
Yeah, but that'd still be super interesting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to. The only reason I even bring it up is because the data's all in, and I'm excited to start playing.
It's like Christmas, man. It's like Christmas.
Like, hey, I might learn something new.
You did such good great data analysis last year too. Like, the write-up was awesome.
Thanks. Yeah, I hope to do something very similar this year, but yeah, maybe we'll learn something new from this.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's totally unrelated to what we're talking about.
I'm excited always. Yeah.
But anyway, and that's kind of getting close to time for us as well. But before we do wrap up, I know that you guys, TSA, you guys have your own podcast that you guys are doing. How's that going?
It's been a lot of fun. We just had on a sports psychologist. I think we're going to have on another sports psychologist. We're going to have on JP Cauchy to talk about preview for IPF Worlds. And it's just like yours, it's been a chance to talk about fun stuff with smart people who like talking about it.
Right. I've listened to some episodes. I think it's really cool. I'm subscribed to your podcast. So
appreciate that.
I'm a fan.
Speaking of studies, by the way, we're thinking of doing one ourselves.
Oh, really?
We did one a while back, and this one will be totally different. But we'll be testing something interesting. So I'll put out an APB for subjects soon. But I'm excited about that too.
So if I was interested in that or something, how would I avail myself?
Got it. So follow the coaches on Instagram, and when the time is right, we'll post up a big thing. I'll put a link on the website where you can submit a form with some information. We will probably be looking for intermediate male lifters, so probably age 18 to 30 with a class 2 or 1 Wilks, and have lifted in at least one powerlifting competition. That's probably what we'll set as guidelines.
Yeah.
And then from there, just that you're willing to commit, I think, 8 weeks of your time.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Very cool. Yeah, well, I'll look forward to that as well. Anything else? How you mentioned Instagram. Is that where you guys are most active, social media-wise?
Social media, we're Instagram and Facebook are the 2 things we use. Not Twitter, like, to any extent. But yeah, you can find us there. You can contact us on email. You can go to the website, thestrengthathlete.com, and send us a message on the contact form and find out more about our services and what we do. Excellent. But yeah, we always love answering questions about strength training as well, and email is a good way of going about it.
Yeah, I totally agree. All right, sounds good. Well, thanks everyone for watching. Thanks, Bryce, for hanging out. Good chat.
It's been a blast.
Yeah. See you next time.
Reactive Training Systems.